as we're used to, so I'm glad we have this opportunity to meet briefly tonight. As both Hela and Dina mentioned in their introduction, my area of specialty is designing for children with special needs, specifically for children with autism. I won't be talking completely about that tonight, but I will be talking about a general belief that I have about the importance of architecture and its role in everyone's lives, not only the lives of children that are in need of a very specific built environment. Of course, during the questions and answers that I hope I'll leave enough time at the end to get your input. If anyone has questions about the autism work that I've done, I'd be happy to answer them or provide you with more information. But tonight's lecture was actually Dina's idea. Her suggestion to me was to share with you something that I have shared with my students for the many years that I've been teaching architecture. One of them is sitting in the back, so he can tell you whether I did a good job or not, is a belief that I have that architecture can be very powerful. And I think it's a power that some architects take very responsibly, others do not, because as they say, with great power comes great responsibility. And as designers, we have a responsibility to make sure that we're handling this power carefully. If you think about your daily life, even just today, I would challenge you to think of one thing that you have done on your way to us here that hasn't been decided or managed or influenced by someone, a designer, outside of you, who's made a decision for you on how you're going to conduct that part of your day. For example, you wake up in the morning, you reach for the switch to turn on the light. If it's too high, if it's too low, if it's too far, that's a decision that a designer has made for you. If your window is facing east, then the sun has risen and shone into your room and woken you up to prepare you mentally for the day, and that's a good thing. If your room is not facing east, you'll wake up in the dark, which doesn't prepare you mentally for the day. So the designer that decides to place your bedroom or place the window within your bedroom in a certain orientation is influencing how you behave at the beginning of that day. And as you walk to the bathroom to take a shower, or to the kitchen to make a cup of tea, how that is laid out and how you get there is decided by a designer, whether it's an easy route, whether it's a complicated route, whether you have to pass by your brother's bed and wake him up on your way, and that's a problem for him every morning. Those are all decisions that designers have made for you. And it's not only on the scale of the house, it's on the scale of your neighborhood, on your building, on your city, as you come through traffic. The designers that design our city's streets and design the urban environment around us are influencing how we move throughout our city every single day. So designers have tremendous power over our lives and how enjoyable or unenjoyable, how easy or difficult those lives are. And that's why I titled this lecture Designing Everyday Life, because that's the way I like to look at architecture. That we are designers of life. We are the designers of how people carry out their lives on a daily basis, whether it's a school, a university, a hospital, a police station, an airport, a metro station, a street, a bridge, whatever it is, a designer decides how you live your life through that experience. So I'll begin with that statement, the power of architecture and the importance of it. But I also want to talk about what good design is and how important good design is. And this was, again, the suggestion of Dina to share with you what I think good design should be. I'm going to start with a very interesting quote coming from an interesting person, Winston Churchill, who was a politician, nothing to do with architecture, never studied architecture, but he, as a politician, understood the power of the built environment over his people. He understood that there's democratic architecture, he understood that there's oppressive architecture, that through this design you can control people's lives. And that's a whole different conversation we've been having for many years now. We can have maybe in another session, but I think this quote is very relevant to what we're talking about today, that we shape our buildings as designers, as architects, as engineers, but then the buildings shape us. They decide for us how we are going to live our lives. So that brings me to the question that I hope tonight we'll look at together of the answer to the question, what is good design? And I use the word design here because I don't want to necessarily limit our discussion only to architectural design. A lot of what we'll talk about here could apply to all sorts of design, urban design, industrial design, fashion design, interior design, product design. The question of design itself is very relevant to all of the elements that we're going to be talking about today. And as you can imagine, and because we have architects in our audience, I'm sure that many of you have your own opinion of what good design is. And you have your own opinion of examples of good design that you've seen in your life or experienced in your life, or viewed through catalogs, through books, through the internet, or through even buildings that you've visited yourself. So it was a big challenge for me after these many years of studying and designing and working with a lot of architects and in different capacities, attending a lot of meetings and conferences, and through my work, I've had a great opportunity to work with some of the best architects in the world. And I decided to make that selection of what to me is good design as sort of a journey through the architects that I have been exposed to and have worked closely with. Some of them I call my friends, some of them are colleagues, some of them I've just been exposed to their work through personal and professional means. But I decided to make the selection of examples of what are good design by a journey through the people that my life has intersected with in the architectural world. And I'm going to try and explain each example that I am going to show you in specifically how I view it as good design. So the first example, I wanted to start at home here in Egypt, because I don't think it would be responsible of me to bring to you a set of good design that's a dream that's outside of our horizons. I think it's important to demonstrate that good design can happen very easily here at home with just a little bit more awareness. So this first example is good design is creating architecture that responds to the landscape. And I know for those of you who are architects and non-architects, the word landscape has a very specific definition. We usually think of natural landscape, we think of paintings, we think of trees and mountains and rivers and lakes and meadows and animals. But that is not the only definition of landscape, or at least that's not the definition of landscape that I think is relevant to this example. The definition of landscape that I'd like to present is a little bit more broad, is a little bit more widened. It involves our social-cultural landscape, our political landscape, our environmental landscape, our economical landscape, historical, so on and so forth. So it's not just about, about the physical surroundings of a building, but it's also about all those other layers. And that's what I believe a landscape should be seen as. So good design is creating an architecture that responds to that landscape. And the example I've brought to you is something that's probably very familiar to many of us. Yes, this is the Alexandria Biblioteca, designed by Snøhetta, whose founding partners are Craig Dykers and Kjetil Thorsen. I had the opportunity to work with both of these gentlemen on several occasions, the last of which was just a few weeks ago in Vienna. And I think of this as one of the more successful buildings in our country, and more of the successful buildings even in our continent. I was working with architects in South Africa, and there's a lot of appreciation and value given to this building and how it integrates with this very complex landscape that I was talking to you about, and how it symbolizes and represents the history of the library, the history of our country, its importance of our culture and our civilization with regards to the world's civilization as well, and the role that Alexandria Library played in that Western civilization. The next slide is a short video by Kjetil, an interview conducted by the Lucerne Museum in Denmark. You can find all this material online if you want to see the entire video. And in it, he explains the thought process behind the library. And I think it's important for those of you who don't know, and this is information that I've got firsthand from them, that this library was their first winning project. It was the first time they won a competition. And sometimes we think of these star architects as celebrities who have never failed, but they were losing competitions until the Alexandria Library. And that library changed their career completely. From that point onwards, they will tell you that the Alexandria Library is what made their career. Their latest building that just opened in September, this last September, is the 9/11 Memorial in New York City. It's a very important building. So they've gone from a small office who was winning nothing to building possibly one of the most important museums in our contemporary history. So this is a very important milestone for them. So I'll leave you to listen to Kjetil explaining their approach.
We'll try it outside. We had actually gone for a competition in Canada first, but then the Alexandria Library competition came out during that process, and we decided to really try that. Of course, it's historical, very important. It's a mythology almost related to what it was. I had been traveling in Egypt for a few months, a couple of years earlier, and had fallen a bit in love with the country, I must say. Also the vastness of the history, deep science-related history, which so strongly influenced the Renaissance, and the library not only being a library, but a research place for scientists, and discovering mathematics, and going deep into all the elements that describe later history. Pythagoras, calculating the circumference of the Earth, with one pole in Aswan and one pole in Alexandria. Wonderful, just by reading the shadow length. I mean, geometry is science, capturing of books and wisdom. So these type of things were stories and relationships and historical importance of the beginning of the Greek era, the understanding of our civilization, you could say, the Western civilization. Yes, so when the library in Alexandria came up, it was just the most exciting type of competition related to content. At the beginning, you just try to interpret the program that you have in front of you, and you try to look at the site and the conditions and the weather conditions, and you know you have a lot of restrictions. So you try to evolve a concept that you think satisfies exactly these notions that might be the same in Norway as in Egypt. Like I said, more the general aspect of humanism, you could say. And the library in Alexandria was a stronghold for humanism in its time when it was operating, because science was such an enormous part of knowledge, the knowledge-based human evolution. And to that extent then, what you have to do is to find something that represents that notion today without copying the Greek library tradition, yes? And without going into and removing the myth from people's minds. One of the most dangerous things you can do is to give shape to a myth that is already established in millions of people's minds. Because when you give it a shape, you take away their own picture of what this might have been. So it had to be somehow distanced from the relationship between what people had in their heads, what the history was, and how we interpreted it again. So quite obviously, as you know, it became also this intersection in time, like a time lapse. And the geometry is actually a torus. It's a turning element like a car tire, but stopped and frozen at some point in time. And on one hand, it pushes the ground down. At the other, it lifts the ground up. And exactly where it cuts the ground, it's sort of tilting on this line, invisible line. So you could easily say, in a relationship of past, present, and future, that the presence is now, obviously. So it's where I am. Within the split of a second, is presence, is now. That is always related to the horizon and where you have your eyes, because your eyes are always where you are, and the horizon is always where your eyes are. So even if I sink slightly lower now, I have a different horizon than you have, geometrically speaking, right? So horizon is a very individual thing, but it's also a very general thing, because it has a general definition. So now is the horizon, where the sun goes up and the sun goes down behind. It's the simplest way of defining now. Defining yourself in time in a specific place. So that was the tilting point, the ground. Where it's pushed down could be past or present, and where it's lifted could also be past or present. That's up to you how you define it. But at least you would discover layers of possible histories tilting around the present.
That was Kjetil Thorsen, who introduced nicely into this next project of Snøhetta. And both Craig and Kjetil will tell you that the Alexandria Library really was their gateway to all these big commissions that they were getting. The next project that they moved directly into after the Alexandria Library was the Oslo Opera House, that many of you are probably familiar with. And it was an extremely radical at the time approach to an opera house in Europe particularly, who had a very classical approach to what opera was and its role in society. And I think it's interesting what Kjetil says in the interview about the role of the library with regards to the history, and he's considering the history as part of the landscape that he has to deal with, and the imagination of people of what the library was before as part of the landscape that he needed to respond to. And in this building, he takes him and both of them take this idea of the landscape further into a more physical manifestation. So the building literally becomes part of the landscape of the city. And this is a picture in the summertime of the same building in Oslo, and how this urban space literally embraces and wraps up and around an opera house, where historically opera houses were very separate from urban space. There would be a big plaza. The typical European model is a big plaza, and the opera house that was very elite and secluded from the general population. And they found this very interesting. They took it upon themselves as a challenge, and they were almost certain that they wouldn't win, because this idea of bringing opera to the streets, bringing opera to the younger generation, might have seemed counterintuitive, not a logical way to approach it, but they always have this sense of the role of the building to become part of the city's landscape. And a very funny video that Craig shared with me in our last trip in Vienna, I think really symbolizes their success in bringing opera to the streets and bringing the youth into opera, and I'll show you the video in the next slide. Very different movie. So I think this, and they agree, that this video is very interesting. This video was sent to them by this extreme sports group to show them how this young generation was dealing with this opera house that had historically been so removed from that culture. These are completely opera, and motorcycles and heavy metal music are completely different cultures. And the fact that a building can bring all of these landscapes together, to me and to them, I think is very interesting. But their work isn't only about opera houses and libraries. They also work on very small scales, which is something I really admire in them, that they don't think of themselves as too big of a firm to do very small buildings. This beautiful building that takes the tradition of Norwegian woodcraft to a whole new level. It introduces digital fabrication using CNC machines. Some of you, the architects, will understand what I mean by that, but that's digitizing and using computers to actually build as opposed to handmade products. And this is a reindeer viewing pavilion on a mountain. Ironically, it's the mountain of Snøhetta, which is the name of the firm. It's the name of a mountain in Norway. And this is the end of a trail that overlooks the mountain where you can view reindeer in their natural habitat. So it's a completely different landscape that they're dealing with in this case, a landscape with animals, a landscape with preservation and conservation, but it's a very interesting form that they chose to use to display this landscape and this public function. And then on the extreme opposite spectrum is a very urban, very city landscape. This is New York Times in New York City. It's now currently, if anyone visits New York, I was there a couple of weeks ago, there are parts of Times Square that are now shut down. They're rerouting the traffic on Broadway to go around Times Square, and Snøhetta's proposing, and the city of New York is now implementing, completely pedestrianizing that part of Broadway and Times Square with no vehicles. So literally the people of New York will now have ownership of Times Square completely, which is a very radical and very interesting premise, and the work that they've done, I haven't seen it, it's not completed yet, but I'm sure it will be a fantastic urban space in a very crowded and dense and dynamic city. And this final project that I'll share from Snøhetta's work, some of you who are keeping up to date with the latest that's happening in architecture, this is the 9/11 Pavilion that opens up to the museum underground. This is the site of the World Trade Center in New York City, Ground Zero. The big black pool of water is where this is where the North Tower stood. And the fountain area, they didn't design that fountain, but their pavilion is in the back. And one of the things I love about Craig and Ketel's work is their use of light and material, and their building almost dissolves. It doesn't appear that there's anything there at certain times of the day where the sun strikes it, which is important because it's the only building, it's the only structure that's actually built on the site of Ground Zero, nothing else. Ground Zero has been emptied, and all the new buildings are happening on the periphery, so this is the only one. The building in the back, this one here, the pavilion. The fountain is part of the master plan, and this is the pavilion. It's the entrance to the underground museum where all the remnants and kind of the memorial to the Ground Zero Museum is. So it's a very small building. It's a very subtle, very humble building, but at the same time, it's very, very powerful in its materiality. And to them, it was probably the most difficult project to negotiate its landscape, because you can imagine what a difficult landscape and how many stakeholders. They even use a word that I like to use when it's related to design, which is negotiation. It wasn't about design, it was about negotiation. It was negotiating the different stakeholders and making sure that they came up with something that was respectful for everyone. Okay, so moving on to the next point that I think is relevant from the work of my friends. Good design is building beautifully with renewable and responsible resources. A lot of us more and more are talking about sustainable design, sustainable energy, sustainable urban spaces, sustainable everything. We've heard sustainable food, sustainable fashion, sustainable media. I mean, now everyone puts the word sustainable in front of their product to give it a little bit more credibility. But in architecture, there's a lot of room for this type of sustainability, and one of the most powerful ways is to use materials that are renewable or recycled or recyclable. 30% of the world's carbon footprint is a result of the built environment. So that's tremendous. If we can reduce how much we are actually producing as in carbon footprint by the way we build and the choices we make, we can have an incredible, possibly the most impact. We would have more impact than traffic and reducing oil in mobility and transit. So these kinds of choices are really very relevant. The work that I've chosen to symbolize this approach is the work of Shigeru Ban, a Japanese architect. He won the gold medal from the International Union of Architects in Tokyo when I was there. I'm a member of the International Union of Architects, and that's how I know him. He has really taken the craft of traditional Japanese carpentry and brought it together with a very modern, cutting-edge, innovative approach, and he's creating beautiful buildings that have stretched the use of wood technology to limits that a lot of people didn't think were possible. And timber or wood is a great building material because of its sustainability, because it's one of those few materials that renews. When you cut down a tree, if you balance it well enough and you don't cut out too much, it will renew itself and grow back again. You can plant another tree. So it's one of those resources that we can regrow, not like stone or earth or other things or water that are limited as resources on our planet. Timber is one of the few resources that we can build with that's actually renewable. The French government in 2010 passed a law that prevents homeowners from building homes of a certain scale with any material but timber, to make sure that that becomes the primary material that's being used throughout France. So Shigeru has really used timber in very interesting ways. Here is a building, the Tamida office building, that uses timber in the same way a steel structure is used to create high-rise, large-span office buildings using these traditional methods of connecting wood. And another material that he's probably more famous for using is paper. This is called the cardboard cathedral. Its main structure is those cylindrical frames on the inside of the triangle, and those are made out of recycled cardboard. They're very heavy duty, they're treated with certain materials, so they're fire safe and they're very sturdy. And it's incredible that he can create these structures. He holds the world record for the largest span paper structure in the world. The next point I want to talk to you about is another Japanese architect, Toyo Ito. Sorry, not Toyo Ito, Tadao Ando. And the work that, or the point that I want to make with his work is that good design is understanding of the elements. Light, air, and water. And I always tell my students, we forget that there are a lot of things in architecture that are for free. There are a lot of things, we spend a lot of money on finishing materials, on beautiful marble, on beautiful wood and ornamentation, but we forget things like light and air and water are for free. And they can really, when used well within our environments, add a dimension and add a quality to our spaces with very little expense if they're used properly. And possibly the best architect in my mind who does this is Tadao Ando. He was also one of the architects that I had the pleasure to work with in Tokyo in 2011 during our UIA Congress there. And he has built throughout his career many churches, and I feel that it's the churches that best symbolize how he uses light. And he uses light, as he has told us, almost as a material itself. So it's the only architectural material that has a life to it. It moves, it changes throughout the day. So this is an image in one of his churches at a certain time when the light lines up with the cross in the north facade of the building. And that changes throughout the day as the sun sets and the sun rises. Its angles change throughout the year from summer to winter. So you get a different experience every time you're in the church. But this idea of light being a material and being able to define space and create space and give you a certain spiritual experience inside a space, I think is a trademark of one of his that is very successful. This second church was called the Church on Water. He uses water in this case to reflect the idea of the cross and the idea of the church, and the church is almost floating, which is to me very interesting because historically, when those of you who have studied history of architecture, religious buildings were always presented as buildings of strength, as buildings of dominance. The cathedral was always the biggest building in the European city. It was usually the highest, usually the strongest, so it was a question of dominance. And what he's presenting is it's a question of humility. It's very light, it's very almost transparent, it seems like it's floating, which I think is a very beautiful use, again, of something that's a very inexpensive material, and it gives you a wonderful quality of reflection, which is water. And this last church, it's the Church of Mount Rocco, where he uses the inverse of what we saw in the first slide, where it's not the light that represents the cross, but the shadow. So as the sun moves through this window on the left, a shadow is cast on the ground that represents the cross. And again, that cross moves in the chapel throughout the day. And as you know, churches are always oriented north, south, east, west along the cardinal points. So there's a very specific track that he understood of where that shadow would move throughout the space and throughout the day. So the next group of slides represents a principle of good design being creating an architecture that dissolves boundaries. And this is something that I focus a lot in my studio and with my students. And I think it's very important that we don't look at design as it has to be either or. It has to be open or closed. It has to be strong or weak. It has to be up or down. It has to be in or out. It has to be natural or man-made. It have to be poor or rich. We need to find a middle ground. We need to be able to break down those boundaries, that it doesn't have to be either or, it can be both. And I think one of the best examples of this, and he's the person who brought to my attention this binary approach that we take to design, an architect called Rahul Malhotra, who is now at the Graduate School of Design in Harvard, but has a practice in Mumbai. And I really admire Indian architecture and Indian architects because they have such a similar sensibility to ours. They have a culture that's very similar to ours, cities that are very similar to ours. There are a lot of issues that we can learn from how Indian architecture and Bangladeshi and Southeast Asian architecture can be relevant to what we do here in our culture. So this building may be not as romantic as the churches of Tadao Ando. This is an office building for a tech company. I think it's in Bangalore, if I remember correctly. And you see here in the lobby of the building someone who seems to be very clearly an executive, and a woman who seems to be very clearly a traditionally dressed Indian woman, who is most probably a janitorial or custodial worker in the building. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with Indian culture is an extremely classist culture. They have what they call a caste system, which means that the socioeconomic sectors of society are completely separate from one another. The rich and the elite are completely separate from the working class. A few decades ago, alhamdulillah, this practice has been more or less outlawed now in India. There was a group of people that were called the untouchables. They were so low in the social economic class that no one would interact with them. They were the poorest of the poor. They were the workers, the garbage men, the people that were doing the jobs that no one else wanted to do. And they were literally called the untouchables in that society. And Rahul had a very specific approach to that this is something that he feels needs to change in his culture. And that no longer can there be this social economic elite that is separate and operating separate from the economic poor. And that for the country to move forward, which is very similar to what's happening in our own country, we need to break down the divide and dissolve this social gap. And he did it, and you would think, well, how is an architect going to do that? It's ridiculous. This is a job of a social worker, or a politician, or the government, or a religious charity, or someone, not an architect. And how can this be achieved through design? And I think he did it very beautifully. And he did it by not only breaking down between social classes, he did it by breaking down between the man-made environment and the natural environment. This is the elevation of this office tower. It's a green wall. Green walls have become very popular, very widespread in a lot of architectural projects. We even have a great organization here that's run by two brilliant young Egyptian men called Shadouf. If anyone is interested to look at green wall technology, they do some wonderful work. And you can imagine green walls have all these environmental and climatic benefits. But what Rahul did in his building is that he proposed not only a green wall, but like this green space. He imagined taking these gardens that are typically put outside of office buildings and big corporate campuses and wrapping them up the facade of the building. And the reason wasn't only to make the building more environmentally friendly, it helps with the cooling, it makes it a more beautiful space to live in, and all the benefits environmentally. But he kind of did a tricky thing and slipped in a social responsibility element by wrapping this garden up to the facade of the office building. He took the gardeners and the workers that had to maintain that garden and brought them up into the office building as well. So he created this beautiful space that is completely accessible for the gardeners, and they're very independent of what's going on in the office building. And they have their own little space, and they go up and they tend the garden, and they're seen by the executives that are working in their offices, which is something in India which is very, very unusual. For there to be any space where the economic elite and the socially poor would mix. It's something that would never happen. So I think with this very small intervention that I think is brilliant, he gave dignity to these workers who are hidden away and we pretend they don't exist, who come in at night and clean our offices and take care of our lawns so we can be in these beautiful spaces. And he brought them into our spaces and forced us to have exchanges with them and to recognize their role in our society, which I think is a very beautiful gesture. The next group of slides and group of principles, I think, also bring this idea a little bit closer to home for us. That I believe good design is understanding and respecting alternative modes of practice. And this is something I talk about a lot in my studio, and I talk about a lot in my writing and my articles and books and so on. This idea of there's no one way to design, and there's no right way to design. And a lot of architects classically will tell you this is how you have to do it. The whole modern movement, the whole international school of architecture was built on this principle, that one building, one solution, one space will give everything to everyone, and if you can't fit into it, there's something wrong with you. The building is perfect. And this was a mentality that, as we know by history, has been challenged and now seen as perhaps an incorrect assumption. So what I've been working on, and again, this is something we can talk about maybe in the questions and answers, of responding to alternative ways of how people build. There's a very important statistic that I like to use when I'm discussing and trying to make an argument for this case wherever I go. I recently presented it to the Vice President of the Royal Institute of British Architects, who's responsible for their international affairs. So you would expect a man who understands what's going on in the rest of the world. And I told him, do you realize that everything we've been talking about architecture, every piece of work that we've done, every bit of funding that we've generated, only really caters to 4% of the world's population. 96% of the world's population live and build in environments that architects have absolutely no role in whatsoever. These are communities that are building and maintaining and creating built environments for themselves, by themselves, with no help from us as professionals. And I think I'm one of those people that think that this needs to change. Not that we know better, that we need to stop this 96% for building for themselves, but we need to learn from how they must be successful if they're able to have this majority stakehold over the built environment. They must be doing something right. Yes, there are drawbacks. And I'm talking about the informal sector. I'm talking about what we call في مصر العشوائيات. And I think it's interesting that we call it بالعربي العشوائيات, and in the West they call it informal, because عشوائيات talks about chaos, so it's immediately a negative connotation. A colleague of mine who's doing some brilliant work about العشوائيات called Yahya Shawkat, he has a whole series called الحق في السكن. It's a series of documentaries that you can see for free on YouTube. And one of the documentaries is called دي مش عشوائيات يا باشا دي مجهودات ذاتية, which I think is an excellent definition. Because it is مجهودات ذاتية. It's people mobilizing, financing, and building for themselves. We may not, as an architect, have built that way, but they are producing 96% of the world's built environment. We're only producing 4%. But still, we feel we have a right to say this is how it needs to be done. So I like to challenge myself and my students, and you, hopefully, to embrace alternative ways of doing things. There are different ways of creating the built environment that we have to understand. One great example of this type of understanding and respect for alternative modes of practice is a project that was done and discussed actually here on this table between myself and other colleagues with one of the partners in the firm Urban Think Tank, Lindsay Sherman. Urban Think Tank is a South American-based practice, and the project that we're seeing here is not a project that they've built. It's a project that they've documented and studied and researched and presented a proposal for. This is called Torre David, which is a office tower in downtown Caracas, Venezuela. It was built much like we have our own Torre David in Zamalek, a tower that was built decades ago, and for one reason or another, it has never been occupied. And that's what happened in this building. It's this concrete, huge, multi-story tower, and it was never occupied. Probably the funding of the developer fell through, or something happened, or the laws changed, something happened that the building was never completed and the clients never moved in. So it's this abandoned tower in the middle of a very dense, very overpopulated city. And naturally what happened is the informal sector moved in. They moved in and took over completely this entire tower. And they created for themselves, and you're talking about a tower that doesn't have services in it. It's incomplete. So there are no elevators. There's an adjacent garage with a ramp that they use with their bicycles to bicycle up to the upper floors. And it's interesting because it's such a vertical tower that it's become like vertical neighborhoods. So every 5 or 6 floors, which is the walkable distance, are like a little community. So you live in that community, go up and down. I urge you to go online and take another look at this project particularly because it's a fascinating project. There are shops, there are schools, there are daycare centers, there are pediatricians, pharmacists, football pitches. Everything you would imagine that needs to be provided in a community is provided in this tower. And so what the people of Urban Think Tank did is they proposed to the city a way to keep these tenants in the tower, but add to it so they could bring in new tenants. And they proposed systems, brilliant low-cost systems, like, for example, creating an elevator that worked like a train. Rather than using a lot of electricity and every single person who wanted to go up to a certain floor to ride the elevator alone, the elevator would work like a metro. So it would stop on the 5th floor, 10th floor, 15th floor, 20th floor, 25th floor at certain times during the day, and you could ride it like you would ride a metro. You would pay a ticket and you would go up, and that's how they could pay for the electricity to maintain the elevator. So all of a sudden, these people would have access to their little neighborhoods at very low cost. So ideas like this, they wanted to expand like a wind generating panel that you can see to generate electricity and so on and so forth. But it was amazing how self-organized these people were in what we call informal. It was extremely formal. It was well thought out, it served their purposes, they needed nothing from anyone else, they were managing on their own, and they completely occupied this discarded building, which I think was extremely interesting. And I think it's very valuable that there are practices like Urban Think Tank that respect and acknowledge these alternative ways of doing things. Another project that UTT worked on, this is a favela. It's called the Barrio Sant Agustin, also in Caracas, Venezuela. It's a complete informal settlement. This is all self-built. These are little shacks. They started as this very small number of little shacks and crawled up the side of this mountain. If you zoom out of the picture, you can see a very high-end, expensive residential community directly adjacent to this. So it's kind of like the Muhandisin Ardelewa relationship, that in very close proximity, within a few hundred meters, you have the poorest people in the city and the richest people in the city coexisting, but completely disconnected from one another. Unaware. I mean, Ahmed and I live on the same street, and I know him, and I see him, and I work with him, but if I were living in Shera Soria at the end, a person living probably closer to me than Ahmed does, I would have no idea who they were, or what they do, or what their lifestyle is, or what their job is. There's just a complete disconnection. And that was the case in the Barrio Sant Agustin in Caracas, Venezuela. One of the major problems, as you can see, that we don't have in our city is the terrain and how difficult it is physically to get up the mountain. There are these tiny little stairs that people walk up. It can take them 150 steps to get to their apartments or their little shacks up there. It's very difficult to move materials, so moving something like television or a refrigerator up to your home is a very, very difficult task. There are a lot of documentaries that have been done about the life of the people of the favelas of South America that are very interesting. But what Urban Think Tank proposed, which I thought was genius, the city of Caracas was proposing creating transportation networks to connect this favela to the city, because that was the demand of the people of the favelas. So they were going to displace and bulldoze thousands of people from their homes to create these roads and ramps so they could drive up to the sites and give access, vehicular access and public transportation access to the favelas. But that means that there were tens of thousands of people that all of a sudden would be homeless, which is something that happens in our city as well. To build the ring road, we displaced tens of thousands of people to give access. So what UTT Urban Think Tank, Lindsay and Hubert and the rest of them proposed, this is the picture of, at the bottom of the slide, is that elite community of Caracas, and the barrios to the right. The yellow marks the public transportation network, or the metro that already exists in Venezuela, and the loop to the right is their proposal to connect it. But they didn't propose to connect it by an underground tunnel, which would be very expensive to build, and they didn't propose to connect it with above ground trains, which would have to displace people, but they did something that I thought was actually very fun. They did like a cable car, a telefric. So it's a cable car system that connects the people of the favela to the main stations, and there's a big station at the top, and there are other stations along the way. And what's interesting is when they build these stations that come down to the ground, in each point where they come down to the ground, first they identified where there were empty plots and buildings that were falling down anyway, so they placed themselves with the minimal disruption to the community. But whenever they touched ground, they brought with them services for the people, medical services, schools, cultural centers, things that the people couldn't provide for themselves. So just these little points, very, I mean, relative to a government's budget, very small budget projects that you can just pinpoint, and by doing so, they've completely revitalized this entire community. And it's become a huge tourist attraction to people visiting Caracas. When the people found that their rooftops were now visible, because before nobody could see the rooftops, they started upgrading and improving the rooftops themselves, painting them colors, planting their roofs, taking care of them. So all of a sudden, this community that was run down and thought of as this black mark that needed to be destroyed became something of value to the city with a very simple, relatively inexpensive solution. And I think it becomes a really beautiful space, a space that we look at El Ashwa'iyat as such a terrible, negative space, can become, with very small interventions, a very interesting and productive space for our cities. So our next point also plays on this idea of informality and how we can learn from informality and how we can learn from this other 96% and what they're doing. So good design is understanding people's traditions and their community's structure and building for it rather than against it. There's a lot of issue and discussion of the architect's ego, and the ego of the architect to come in and say, this is how you have to live, the way you've been living is wrong, the way you've been living is destructive, the way you've been living is stupid, we know how you have to live, and we've designed for it. And a lot of times buildings fail and plans fail for that reason. I'm a believer of, you have to respect the tradition of people and how they practice what they do, because there's a reason these traditions exist. They are things that have been generated over decades, if not centuries of time. And they are something that will ensure success of a project if you understand them and build around them. It's our responsibility to build around them, not against them. So this sketch, and I wish I could zoom in on it more for you, this is an axonometry of a piece of very important architectural history that is now no longer existent. This is the walled city of Kowloon, which is in Hong Kong. It was the informal settlement of Hong Kong. When it still existed, it was the densest place on Earth. It had more people per square meter than anywhere else on the face of the Earth. It was so dense that you could walk completely across the entire neighborhood without ever touching the ground. The buildings were so close together, it would take just a meter or a meter and a half of a small wooden bridge to cross from one person's apartment to the next. And it was layers and layers and layers of people just stacked on top of one another. Eventually, the city of Hong Kong just blew it up, got rid of it, bulldozed it off the face of the earth, and it no longer existed. But when it did exist, a few architects took the effort to document how it worked, because it worked. There were millions of people living in this tiny neighborhood, and they were working, they were functioning. They were going to work, they were making a living, they were taking care of their children, they were receiving their mail, they were managing their garbage somehow. And it was almost an anthropological exercise to figure out how it worked. And I think that this is a very extreme case, but the similar exercise could be done in many of our environments. It's our responsibility as a designer, before we go into a place, to first understand how it works, before we begin to claim that we know how it should work. So another group of architects who are MVRDV, the one partner that I worked with, Natalie de Vries, and her founding partner, Winnie Mass, are some of the more interesting architects because they work in a mode that I, as an academician, really respect, which is a research design mode. They do a lot of research to support their design decisions. They don't just go in and say, this is how it needs to be done. And they conducted a really interesting project in Korea, in South Korea a few years ago, with a lab that funds city research. And they came up with what they call the Vertical Village project. And their idea was, with this mass migration, historically, the largest migration, human migration, we have ever observed is happening now. It's the migration of people from rural environments to cities. So that number of people have never moved from one place to another ever before in our history. And there are going to be more people in cities increasing over the next few decades. But these new inhabitants of our cities come with these traditions. These are people who come from villages, and they have intact these community practices and traditions. So what MVRDV were proposing, why not build on those traditions of villages? Because we all know what happens when you take people like Egyptians who are very tight-knit socially and throw them into mass housing projects. It's a disaster. It doesn't work. They're unhappy. They start changing it. They start doing things to it to be able to recreate this flavor, this vocabulary, this personality, to remind themselves of the environments that they left from. So what MVRDV did is they proposed this way of thinking, of designing, rather than designing these high-rise towers in the middle of the city that no one wants to live in, design what they call vertical villages, which I thought was very, very interesting. And of course, throughout Asia, there's this move by city planners to densify the cities, and there's a lot of reasons why that's a good idea. I won't get into them. But if we assume that densification of urban environments is a good idea, how can we still preserve the sense of the human scale? If I am in Burj Khalifa on the 126th floor, I have no sense of groundedness to the place that I'm in. Another friend of mine, I'll show you their work in a moment, Yoshihiro Tsakanata, who is one of the partners in Atelier Bauau in Japan, once I was at one of his exhibitions, and what he was presenting was a very interesting phenomena that's happening in Tokyo. There are people in Tokyo who live in these high-rise apartments. They take the elevator down every morning, down to the underground that's directly under their building. They get on the train, they go to the next station where their office is, they go up the elevator to their office, they work until the end of the day, they go down the elevator again. The underground system in Tokyo is a whole parallel other city. There are supermarkets. I even saw dentists and doctors and hairdressers and supermarkets, full-blown, not little kiosks, full-on supermarkets, underground, designed to be able to provide the people of Tokyo what they needed on their way home. And he realized that there are millions of people in the city living these lives, and we know how industrious the Japanese are, and they never see daylight. They never breathe fresh air for the 7 days a week. They're going down elevators, through subways, and never reaching the ground. And that to him was problematic, and to the people of MVRDV is also problematic. But if we assume that densification is necessary, then how can we create this sense of a connection to the real world, a connection to nature, a connection to the ground with people hanging up in the sky? And these are the types of vertical village solutions that they're proposing, of bringing people into smaller communities, breaking these towers down into, similar to what the people in Tordavid did in Caracas themselves, creating a more manageable set of people and more like a village community, even if it's on the 126th floor in the sky. This next group of projects is by Yoshihara and Momoyo, the ones I just mentioned, that good design is identifying potential and creating flexibility. And I think this is really important. A lot of the projects that I do in my studio, and I'm going to show you a few of them quickly at the end, is this idea of looking what we have and trying to identify spots of potential that I can work with, rather than always imagining that I have a blank page, because we never have a blank page. I mean, Ketil was talking about a landscape. If you really embrace this idea of a landscape, you never have a blank page. Even if you're building in the middle of a desert, you do not have a blank page. There are things you are responsible for incorporating into your design. So identifying potentialities in already built environments, to me, is something that's very important. And this project, I think, really symbolizes this in the best way possible. This is the BMW Pavilion as part of the Guggenheim Museum's traveling exhibition project. It's in New York City. It's designed by a wonderful, small, but very effective architectural firm called Atelier Bauau, and it's run by Momoyo Kajima and Yoshihiro Tsakanata. And BMW funded this because they wanted to experiment with a new material that they were using in their cars. Any of you who are fanatics of cars know about carbon fiber and how it's a very lightweight, very powerful material, much more powerful than steel. It's very expensive, but it's much more powerful than steel and very, very lightweight as a material to use. So they built this wonderful, it may not seem wonderful now, it'll seem wonderful as I move the slides along. So this is a tiny, tiny little space, more or less an alleyway between two buildings in New York City. And it's a discarded space that the Guggenheim Museum rented from the city for a while. And they created this box that comes and is placed in between these buildings, and it's so lightweight that it can be put on the back of a big truck and taken away and installed somewhere else. And inside this box is like a treasure box of activities that can come down and up depending on what they need to do. So the space beneath the box can become a lecture series, like what we're doing today. It can be a seminar space. It can be a space for exhibitions and street art. It can be a space that's left open during the day for individuals and people working in the city to come and sit and plug in and have Wi-Fi and do their work. And it has become such an interesting space in the different ways that the city has chosen to use it. And all this stuff packs up into the box and can be brought back down again with different layers and different mechanisms. And it's like an urban park in a box. And it's very small and it's very lightweight, and it's just really, really ingenious of identifying a tiny little potential and making so much out of it. An equivalent to this that I can think of in our city is Sayed Tasawi. I think even though you can say as architects, yes, the materials that they use are not brilliant, yes, the form is not the most beautiful, but I think it's a very successful project because it identifies potential of a discarded space in a very important location in our city. And I think it's one of the very, very few places where that socioeconomic mix that I was talking about in the Indian project can actually happen. You can have a taxi driver and a director of a bank and a fashion model and an artist and a musician all attending the same event in one space. And that rarely happens in our culture, and I think it's very successful because of the way it has approached its design. The next approach is good design is creating opportunity and designing for possibility. And I always tell my students, design for the unknown, design for what the building can become, design with a little bit of incompleteness for people to be able to complete for themselves later on. Don't define everything very rigidly. And the best project that comes to mind is a project by a group called Sena, another Japanese group of architects, Sajima and Nishizawa. This is the Rolex Learning Center in the Polytechnic in Lausanne. It's a very interesting building, structurally, of course. It's two completely independent waving concrete structures. It waves across this campus. It reminds me of the work of Snøhetta, that it becomes a building as a landscape. It creates these pockets of spaces, so even its footprint on the ground, it hasn't taken up the entire site. So although it's a very, very big building, there's still a lot of open space of the park that's accessible to the public underneath. And they realize that they can use that open space. They do like outdoor cinemas, they do cocktails, they do dinners. In the winter, they turn it into an ice skating rink and people can skate, and they can do all these things underneath the building. In any other building, that underneath space would be gone. It would no longer exist. It's kind of like the Le Corbusier-Piloty idea of a floating building, but in a very different way. And they're very delicate architects. And really what they did with this building is they just created these opportunities for students to decide how they wanted to use this space. Of course, there's a cultural element to this. I don't know necessarily if this would work in any culture. The Swiss culture is very specific in their discipline and self-organization and kind of social respect, that I think internally they would be able to manage a space like that very, very well. May or may not work in other cultures, but again, it's dealing with the landscape that you have at hand. And I'm going to take a look at, again, trying to bring it back home, this idea of good design being social responsibility, building in, for, and with the community. And I'm going to use the work of a man who's very, very dear to my heart, and a man that I worked with for many years, Abdel Halim Ibrahim. He is the winner of the Aghen Award for Architecture for his cultural park for children in Sayyida Zainab. It's just down the street, just further down this street is Gama Ibn Tulun, for any of you who are familiar with the area. I'm sure many of you know of this building. I don't know how many have visited. Unfortunately, visiting it now, today, is a very depressing experience. It isn't what it used to be. But the reason I'm including it is because I think the reason he won the Aghen Award wasn't because necessarily it was a beautiful building. It is a beautiful building, it's a beautiful park. But my belief is that he won it because of this wall, which is the wall of the park that connects the park to the city or to the community that is around it. This community, this street is called Shara Abu Dahab, and in designing the park, he initiated an NGO called Jam'iyat Abu Dahab, which would then provide microloans and provide social services for the women of the community. And in his words, I couldn't think of a better barrier for a children's park to protect them than the mothers of the community. So he gave ownership to these little cubicles and allowed, through this microloan system, the women of the community to open up their own businesses. So they became like the barrier where the community could move into the park through this wall of mothers. So it would ensure that I couldn't think of a better way. There would be no security guard in the world who could do as good a job as 100 women from the community, making sure that the right people go in and the right people stay out and the children are kept safe when they're inside the park. And it also gave value to the park. It allowed the community to be part of the park. It identified what the community needed and gave them a sense of ownership. I think one of our problems in our city is that we, as the citizens of the city, don't feel a sense of ownership of our public space. We're afraid. And I think projects like this break down that fear of we have ownership to our city. We have a right to the city. This last project, before I just show you a few of my students' work, because I just love my students so much and love the work that they do, is a very quick project. And I like to end with it because, to me, good design is understanding and integrating everything that's at play. So we've talked about a lot of criteria, but in the end, good design is about doing all of these things, not just one of them. And an example that came to mind is the work of Bjarke Ingels. His firm is called BIG. He's housed in Denmark. I first met him in Barcelona at the Collegiate School of Architecture's meeting in 2012. I was actually presenting some of my students' work about a pavilion for the revolution, which was a great opportunity for him to see our work as well. He, at the time, was hoping to come visit us in Cairo, but the political situation at the time wasn't fantastic for a visit, hopefully in the near future. This is called the 8 House, meaning the figure 8, and you'll see why it's called the figure 8 in a moment. It's a new housing complex in part of Copenhagen, in the extension of Copenhagen, so it's kind of the equivalent of our new communities like Latamea and 6 October. It's where the city is extending along the fjord, along the waterway. He has quite a few projects in this new community called Ørestad in Denmark. And what's most striking to me is every apartment building in this complex, because it's really more than just a building, it's a whole neighborhood of people, is accessible by bicycle. Anyone who has visited Copenhagen knows that the primary way of getting around the city, it's a very small city, the main way of getting around the city is either by public transportation or by bicycle, and everyone has a bicycle. If you go to the Tivoli Garden in the evening, there are no less than 20,000 bicycles parked outside of the people that have parked them out and are, I wish I'd brought a slide of it, I think it's really very effective. So I will leave you with this video that Bjarg talks about. It's in Danish, but there is translation. I can read it along if we don't feel that we can keep up with the reading. That he talks about, sorry, no, that's not the video yet. This is kind of a preview of the video and of the stages that he went through to reach this final, what you would think, a complex form. And I think one of the things that architects and students of architecture don't really understand is they think that what they call concepts are very arbitrary, that an architect looks at a building, oh, I'll make it look like a figure eight, oh, I'll make it look like a star, oh, I'll make it look like a dome, or I'll make it look like the rising sun. And we think that these are kind of romantic, arbitrary, groundless assumptions, but they're not. And he explains it really well why that's the case.
Københavns nyeste kvarter, Ørestaden, er tænkt som en moderne udgave af Frederiksstaden. En helt ny by opført på bar mark. Og hvor intet er alt muligt, så midt på fælleden er der rig mulighed for at udvikle nye former for arkitektur. Med VM-husene har vi tegnet et tredimensionelt puslespil af lejligheder, og med Boligbjerget har vi bygget en menneskeskabt skråning af villahaver. Og for nylig blev vi bedt om at tegne et nyt hus, eller snarere 2 nye huse, nemlig en kæmpe karré og et lille tårn. Her har vi Amagerfælled, som er det her kolossale grønne område midt i København, som er dobbelt så stort som Dyrehaven. Og Københavns Havn kommer her, som strækker sig hele vejen fra Kongelunden, hele vejen ind igennem byen og op til Nordhavnen. Ørestaden ligger så som det her langstrakte slips langs med metroen, som forbinder hele Indre By ud til Amagerfælled. Og her for enden af Ørestaden ligger vores grund i den her nye bydel, som skal være sådan en form for moderne udgave af Frederiksstaden. Hvis vi prøver ligesom at zoome mere ind på den, så er vores opgave simpelthen i den her karré at tegne 500 boliger og 400 arbejdspladser. Midt på karréen skal der stå et lille tårn, nabobygningen af et kontorhus, og frem for at være vokset sammen ved hoften med et andet hus, foreslår vi en urban celledeling ved at rive de 2 karréer fra hinanden, og i samme hug forærer bydelen en ny plads. Hvis vi prøver ligesom at kigge nærmere på den plads, der opstår, så sker der det, at i det sekund, at karréen forsvinder under fødderne på tårnet, så dumper fødderne ned og står lige pludselig midt på den her plads. Og så i stedet for at være sådan en form for underlig appendix på skuldrene af vores egen karré, så bliver det til sådan en fritstående campanile. Lidt som man kender det fra kirketårnet ved Markuspladsen i Venedig. Altså sådan en monolit omgivet af byrum på alle sider. Og eftersom det skal være sådan et københavnsk tårn, som man kender det fra de her traditionelle tårne og spir, vi har i København, så skal det ikke være sådan en stor skyskraber, men det skal være sådan et højt, slankt tårn. Det skal være så slankt, at det faktisk har et fodaftryk på kun 160 kvadratmeter, som svarer til et almindeligt parcelhus, men vel at mærke et parcelhus i 16 etager. Proportionerne er også lagt fast, det skal være 10 gange 16 meter, henvendt mod syd. Man kan sige, i den øverste del af tårnet, der fungerer det fint, så ligger boligen og kigger ud over den her formidable udsigt hen over taglandskabet på vores egen karré. Men i den nederste del, der ligger de og kigger lige ind i ryggen på vores egen bygning. Så der foreslår vi simpelthen at dreje hele underdelen, sådan så boligerne kigger mod sydvest ud mod pladsen. Resultatet er sådan en form for vredent tårn, som har lidt samme formsprog, som man kender det fra sådan en mælkekarton, lige inden den er ved at brase sammen, når man skal smide den ud. Og resultatet, sådan rent arkitektonisk, bliver de her facetterede, trekantede gavlmotiver, Og faktisk her for enden kan man se det, der kunne minde om sådan en traditionel købmandsgård, altså sådan en spids gavl med sadeltag, som er ligesom en del af det her ellers moderne tårn. Det var så det lille tårn.
Nu mangler vi kun de sidste 57.000 kvadratmeter over i den kæmpe store karré.
Men det er jo et stort hus. Et meget stort hus. Faktisk er det så stort, at det står og vipper på kanten mellem at være en bygning og være byplanlægning. Altså et helt kvarter, som er opført på én gang som et hus. Og hvor arkitektur fremstår smukkest med enkle linjer og klare tanker, så fremstår en by mest levende med som oplevelsesrigdom og overraskelser. Så det er på en eller anden måde sådan en paradoksal udfordring på en gang at skabe enkelhed og variation, at skabe forskellighed og sammenhæng. Altså på en eller anden måde at skabe en by i bygningen. Og der er man i dag blevet meget mere opmærksom på, når man skaber et nyt kvarter eller en ny bygning, at prøve at genskabe noget af den variation, man finder i den historiske by. Men hvordan genskaber man så den? Jo, man kan fx prøve at lave noget, som ligner den historiske by. Og derfor så har man nogle steder forsøgt at skabe Nyhavns tilsyneladende variation af forskellige bygninger, ved at få den samme arkitekt til at tegne alle boligerne, og så få nogle forskellige arkitekter til at tegne facaderne. Altså på en eller anden måde en eller anden form for kosmetisk variation, som ligger som sådan et 40 cm tykt lag uden på en ellers fuldstændig ensartet boligmasse. Man kender lidt sådan fra en westernby, hvor man har taget en masse forskellige facader og smækket dem op på nogle ens bagvedliggende barakker. Men vi er egentlig ikke specielt interesseret i den her form for falske forskellighed. Og måske er der ikke den store forskel på, om man bygger 30 meter til højre eller venstre. Men hvis du bygger 30 meter oppe eller nede, er der en verden til forskel. Især hvis du spørger ejendomsmæleren. Men hvad hvis vi i stedet for at simulere forskellige huse ved siden af hinanden, lægger forskellige funktioner oven på hinanden, som en form for urban lavkage, hvor den enkelte aktivitet ligger aflejret oven på den næste. For eksempel så butikker og kontorer. De kan godt lide at have direkte kontakt til kunderne i gadeplan. De kan godt lide at have store, sammenhængende etager. Og endelig så har de brug for dagslys, men de hader direkte solskin i øjnene eller på computerskærmen. Så derfor så foreslår vi at lægge hele erhvervsdelen nederst i bygningen. Omvendt så kan boliger, de elsker solskin. Til gengæld så hader de at ligge i stueetagen, hvor folk kan glo lige ind i deres lejlighed. Så derfor foreslår vi at lægge alle boligerne oven på erhvervsdelen. Men nu er det sådan, at butikker og kontorer, de har dybere etager end for eksempel boliger. Så hele vejen langs de nederste boliger opstår der sådan en form for sti eller taghave. Lidt ligesom man kender det fra kartoffelrækkerne ved søerne i København.
Our dean has asked me to explain what's going on, just so we can follow. What he's talking about basically is recreating this neighborhood in a building. The typical Danish neighborhood is houses beside one another, with shops and commercial spaces on the ground floor and residences on the top. What he is proposing in his block is thinking of this as layers and giving each group or each user type its optimum position. So bringing all the commercial and office spaces to the ground, creating duplexes of homes on top, apartment blocks above, and penthouses on the rooftop. What's going on? He's now going to show how he then molds the building around what it needs to be.
Som sådan en form for arkitektonisk symbiose.
He'll get to the
Men i
age.
masterplanen har man samtidig bedt om at få en
So the city asks that there are two plazas in the city that need to have direct access to one another. And they don't want this new neighborhood to block that access. But at the same time, he has this huge plot that he wants to work with and not sacrifice any square meterage of space. So that's why he does this tapering in the middle to make the minimum footprint but still be able to have the maximum area. He's actually increased the area because the inclined line is now longer than the straight line. Those diagonals are actually longer than the straight line, so he's got more space than he had before, and he's given the city the space that they wanted to connect the two plazas to one another. And then now he's going to talk about how he optimizes and molds the building around the movement of the sun. And in the north, the way they deal with daylight is very different than how we do in the south. In the south, you're trying to run away from direct sunlight. You're trying to protect your buildings from the heat of the sun. In Denmark, you're trying to open up your building to the sunlight because they don't get it very long, and it's very cold, and sunlight doesn't represent to them a thermal gain. So here he's showing how he models the movement of the sun to optimize allowing as much sun as possible into the buildings, into those dark corners of the courtyard by molding the building down. And those angles, I mean, he does it just with his hand now, but they're very carefully calculated with regards to the angles of the sun at the different times of the day, in winter versus summer, and so on and so forth. And they do a lot of simulation to show how the sun moves into the different parts of the building throughout the day. And with that fold, he also allows view for the people that are stuck in the corner of the building that would have the view of only their neighbors across the corridor. And also with this ramp or this tuck down of the form, he's brought the building down to the ground to allow pedestrian and cycle access all the way to the top. And there's a really nice part of the video that'll start in a moment that shows you the journey of a person entering the building. So this little red man jogging along will take you on a little tour of how someone would be jogging to their home on the way back from work and move through the building.
It's all yours.
Yes, boss, I'm on my mind. I'll try to give you what you like. I can be soft, I can be hard. Let me do.
It's kind of similar to this village-like quality that we were talking about before, that in villages everything's walkable. In informal settlements everything's walkable, and that's one of the big values of these communities. And one of the big drawbacks of these vertical, dense, large-scale 500-unit communities that he's building is that nothing is walkable. You get on an elevator, it's like that Japanese experience. Your experience is a mechanical experience going up and down elevators in a tower. So through this design, and in making it walkable, he's also made it very human and very social. Because in the walkability of things, there are places where people can meet, where children can play. At that, not the X right in the middle of the building, he's created a group of social spaces like a cinema and meeting spaces and cafes where the users and the tenants of the building can meet. Okay, I think I'll stop this video here, just so we have an opportunity to take a conclusive kind of look at my students' work, which I always love to include. So how do we teach good design? I won't show you the process itself because it's very lengthy. You're welcome to come join my classes if you want anytime, open door invitation. But I'd like to show you some of the results of teaching good design. This is an award-winning project by one of our students a few years ago. Her name is Salsabil Amin. She won first prize in the Center for the Study of Built Environments International competition for graduate projects. Her project was located في عين السيرة in Fustat, and she used what we call shipping container architecture, so embracing this idea of using discarded or recycled materials. So her spaces were a group of shipping containers. They were on a scaffolding of structure. They could be plugged out and removed and put on a truck. The project was a hub for NGOs because she realized there are a lot of NGOs operating our city that are completely disconnected. They don't know what each other are doing. And she wanted a place where these people could come together with the community and share their resources, but also be able to reach out to the community. So it's an actual mobile building. The containers plug out, go on trucks, go visit communities, gather information, give them services, come back to the hub and plug back in, and so on and so forth. And it was, in my mind, one of the very successful projects that I'm very proud of. This next project is also a winner of the CSBE award. She's the first Egyptian to win this award, Mariam Zatoun. And her project was redesigning and creating a social community center for حي الزبالين في المقطم من منشية ناصر. And she built her whole project around understanding their process of recycling. At the time when this community was at its highest, before we had these foreign garbage contractors come into our city, they were recycling in the 1990s 80% of their garbage. And when I told this statistic to my friends who are working in waste management and sustainable urban planning in Europe, they were amazed. With all the technology and resources and funding and know-how that they have today, they're not able to reach 80% to recycle all of their garbage. So Qaryat al-Zabalin, with all the disadvantages that it has, was a very, very efficient system of its time. And using, again, the landscape of the area, this is Samain Cathedral that is carved into Jabal al-Mu'attam. It's the main cathedral of that community that's predominantly a Coptic community. It's a beautiful space, it's a beautiful cathedral. I think, and I hope someone can check me on this fact, I think it's the largest rock-carved cave cathedral in the world. And she embraced that idea of carving into the rock and created this beautiful community center out of a discarded rock quarry, mahgar, adim mahgur fil mu'attam. So she was even recycling old architecture and creating something new using this technology that was on site. And this final slide is another award-winning project that we had by Zina Adli and with my colleague Dr. Hisham Gabr and myself, of thinking of how we can reconnect our city to the Nile front. A lot of us, I mean, we all are citizens of this beautiful city, and we have very little connection to one of its biggest assets, which is the Nile. So this is a floating park that she suggests can be built as a prototype. It was located Uddam Asar al-Nabi in the Ma'adi district, but it's something that could be replicated throughout our city. And I just felt that it's important to also include our students' work, because I don't like to present through these lectures these utopian dreams, and some of you leave and say, oh, that was wonderful, but that's in Europe, or that's in Japan, or that's in somewhere else that could never happen here. It can happen here, and it is happening here. And with the work that I'm seeing our students producing, in a few years, they will begin building these projects here. So I'm very optimistic that this movement towards good design can happen. And for those of you who are non-architects and architects in the audience, I want to leave you with this statement that good design is a basic human right. And it's actually something I'm calling for through UNESCO UIA to include it in our Declaration of Basic Human Rights. We have a right to have well-designed cities. We have a right to have well-designed architectures that makes our lives easier. But in order to demand it, we have to first know what it is. Thank you very much. يعني بتفرقش معي اللي يريحكم.
I appreciate you. You select a wonderful topic for this lecture, designing everyday life. Wonderful topic. Your presentation is very wonderful too. But I have a question. Is there a relation between architecture and autism? Of course. How, and is there a relation or not? Thank you.
You're welcome. Pardon? You're a psychologist. Okay, great. All right. I'll tell you a little story about autism and architecture. In 2002, I was a new mother. I just had my first baby. I was a PhD student. I had just finished about 16 months of preparing a proposal for my first comprehensive examination that would then approve my subject so I could start writing my thesis. And I had been working on a completely different subject. I'm almost embarrassed to tell you what it was, because I now think of it as a very irrelevant subject after I've worked in the area that I actually ended up working on. And I had my proposal ready, and my advisor, who's a wonderful woman, many of you may know, Dr. Zakiya Shafi, a very brave woman, one of Egypt's very first female architects, so a pioneer herself. She was waiting for this proposal, and I decided to show it to my father-in-law, who's an architect for Dar al-Handasa here in Cairo, who is an extremely talented architect. I call him the architectural encyclopedia. He knows everything about architecture. So I showed it to him, thought I'd get his opinion and his feedback about what he thought of my other subject. And he read it, and he was very kind, but he's a very honest man. And he said to me, it's interesting, but you know where it's going to end up. And I said, yeah, probably it'll end up on a shelf in a library somewhere when I'm done. And he said, well, you'll be lucky if it's on the shelf. It may be in someone's drawer or even in the trash. I don't think it's important, this whole proposal. So any of you who are doing your thesis work and studying, imagine being in my position, knowing that your exam is months away, knowing that your advisor is waiting your final proposal, knowing that you've worked on it for 18 months already, to hear that. So I made a decision. I could have said, I don't agree with you, I'm gonna do it anyway. I could have broken into tears, I could have done many things, but I decided to ask him why. And he said, I'm a practicing architect. I've been practicing architecture for 40 years, and whatever outcome you will get out of this will be useless to me. I won't need it, it's not important to what I'm designing. I can't possibly think of anyone designing anything that would need this information. And doing a PhD, you have to provide information, you have to provide something new, you have to provide something useful. You have to provide something that is going to push the world of architecture forward, even in a small way, but it has to be effective. So at the same time, quite coincidentally, يعني ربنا بقى بيرتب الحاجات دي, I was asked by a family member and a few of her friends to visit a school that they were starting for their children who were diagnosed with autism. This was in 2002, and I know it doesn't seem that long ago, but in 2002, no one knew what autism was. We even as a family didn't know what it was. So when she came to us, as young architects, myself and my husband, we said, okay, fine, terrific, we can design anything, we're architects. So I went to our references. All of you know our references. I said, I'll find a chapter on designing for autism. There's a chapter on designing for the hearing impaired and the visually impaired and the physically impaired. And among those, I will find a chapter for designing for children with autism. It did not exist in any reference, anywhere in the world. No one knew how to design for children with autism. I wrote emails to people of the International Building Code. I wrote to the American Disabilities Act. I wrote to UNICEF. I wrote to UNESCO. I looked to UNHCR for basic human rights. I was trying to find anything to tell me how to design for children with autism. So I told him this story, and he said, well, there you go. There's a real problem for a real building, for real people, that you can do something about. Why don't you do that? So I called Dr. Zakeya up, and I think when we look back on our lives, there are little moments that change your life forever. If she had said no, I wouldn't be here today, definitely. I think my life would have taken a completely different turn. She's a very brave woman, a wonderful, wonderful scholar. And she believed in me. And she said, I have no idea what you're talking about. I've never heard of this before, but I'm willing to figure it out with you if you're willing to put in the work. We have a deadline in 3 months. I'll give you a week. If you can have a strong proposal on my desk in a week with enough information, enough resources, and enough credible information that I can be comfortable with moving it forward, I will do it with you. And she did. And we wrote our thesis. We went to the school. They were already in an apartment building in Maidi. They were brave enough to take on this challenge. They were generous enough to give me access to their space. They were open-minded enough to think that it would work. We took a group of classrooms, we redesigned one and left the other as it was. I spent 1.5 years living with the children, watching them operate within their space and behave within their spaces to the interventions that we had did. And throughout that time, I began realizing that there was an impact on the children's behavior. And then that became published work, and that published work became the index that Dean Dina was talking about, and then the index began winning awards, and now we're designing a school in Pakistan, and we're about to start designing another school in Saudi Arabia, and all of a sudden, we are the only architects who are designing for autism from that one small decision. So to answer your question, whether there is an influence or not, basically, So you have a little bit of a background about what autism is. So basically, for those who don't understand autism. Autism is what we call a developmental disability, and it affects how these children, an experience like this, by the way, would have completely shut down a child with autism. They wouldn't have been able to handle it. Autism, I like to describe it as an alternative way of seeing the world. It's not a disease. It's not a disability necessarily. It is disabling in that it creates a challenge for those who are struggling with it. But I like to look at it as just a different way of seeing the world. Like one man with autism that I was with in Geneva when we were talking about this with the Human Rights Commission, he said, who told you, he's himself autistic, he said, why do you consider that the way you see the world is the right way to see the world? I mean, I represent 1% of the world's population, which isn't a tremendous minority. I mean, that's a lot of people. You're talking about millions of people around the world. They just see it differently. And that difference is with someone with autism. They will understand and process sensory stimulation differently. So we all experience our world through our 5 senses, through sight, through hearing, through smell, through taste, through touch. And that's how we experience the world around us, and that's how we communicate with one another. Individuals with autism have a problem or a challenge with that processing system. They have certain sensitivities that are higher or lower than the typical person. I don't like to use the word normal because none of us are normal, we're all different. So an individual with autism can be more sensitive to sound, can be more sensitive to visual stimulation, or less sensitive. And the different combinations of that creates the behaviors that they have. So that's where the auto part comes from, the introversion comes from, the tawahud, where they want to be alone and enclosed upon themselves to kind of block out this world around them. And that's a very kind of simplistic, I'm sure our psychologist has a much more technical definition of what it is, but from the architect's perspective, that's how we defined it. And the test that we ran is that we started trying to identify, okay, so what can I do? So the first thing we did with one of the speech therapy rooms is that we soundproofed it. So if this child is hypersensitive to sound, and because there's this background noise, like for example, when that microphone started with the interference, if there were an individual with autism here, there was no way they could block that sound out. We could block it out and continue our conversation. We're not very happy. If it had continued, maybe we'd have gotten used to it, but a person with autism is unable to filter that out. And if you think of that inability from a very young age, in every experience as they're learning to talk, as they're learning to interact, it becomes very difficult for them to learn new skills. So the first thing we did in one of the classrooms is we soundproofed it. The children immediately started responding better. They were able to focus because the attention that they spent blocking out the noise all of a sudden was freed for them to learn something new. And we applied the same principle to their learning environments. We started doing something that I call a compartmentalization of space. So we took a classroom. I walked into the first classroom the first day, and I've written an article about this. And I walked into the classroom, and the first thing that came to my mind was chaos. There were only 6 people in the classroom. They had 6 teachers with them, so one-on-one, but there was chaos. Everyone was doing something different. There was a lot of noise, there was a lot of color, there was a lot of shapes, there was a lot of movement. And for me, as a typical person that doesn't have a sensory processing issue, this was very overwhelming. I couldn't imagine what it was for those kids. So I proposed compartmentalizing the classroom into very specific activities. So there's a corner of the space that's just for puzzles. There's nothing else going on. There's no one else in there except the teacher and the child and the puzzle that they're working on. So everything else is cleared off the table, and that's all they have to focus on. So all of the things that we tested were inspired by one conversation I had with one of the teachers when I asked her, what can I do for you? I'm here, I'm willing to try anything. What can I do for you? She said, there are students I work with where I have a few moments, and it's just a very short period of time where I have their attention. We're looking eye to eye, they're focused, we click, they can get things done, and they learn something in those few seconds, and then it's gone. If you could take those few seconds and make them a little bit longer, if we could just have more of them, I know we can work much better with these kids. And that became our objective. What can we do spatially by relieving them of all this sensory overload, by manipulating the sensory overload. So for example, we designed the spaces that flowed naturally along their pattern. So for example, if their schedule is we arrive in the morning, we sit down for breakfast, and then we do circle time, and then we do puzzles, and then we do speech therapy, we made sure that they're not jumping around different spaces and moving across different experiencing and passing noisy spaces and colorful spaces to do that schedule. We made sure that that schedule was smooth. So they didn't have to deal with anything more than what they needed to learn. And that became the first step. There have been times where I have critiqued myself that this is very, what I call creating a greenhouse effect. It's like taking a plant and giving it its perfect environment. Of course it's going to grow, but if you take it out of the environment, it's going to die. So you can create this perfect environment in the school or in the center for the child, but when you take them out into the real world, they then have to deal with the reality of the real world. And there is a different approach. Other researchers are working on the exact opposite of what I'm working on, which is forcing them to normalize themselves and forcing them to cope with the reality of the world. And I think the solution is somewhere in between. What I propose is starting this in what we call like the survival stage, where the children are completely nonverbal, completely non-attentive. You can't get through to them. They're not communicating with any way. Their tantrums and outbreaks are just getting too much in the way for you to get through to them. You need to do this. And once they start gaining skills, you can start taking away a little bit of that support until ultimately the objective is for them to be independent in a typical built environment. But there are some that that will never be the case. Their autism is so severe. Again, when I was in Geneva, there was one advocate that was supposed to be speaking with me at the United Nations, and he had to speak over video conference. He couldn't even do it live video conference because of the overwhelming sensory stimulation. And the reason was, he said, there's no way I will be able to get from my house to this place in Switzerland, which is the cleanest, quietest, most organized space on earth. It was just too overwhelming for him. So that's basically the approach. The index that we've created is called the Autism Aspects Index. If you want to look it up, there are many articles that have been written about it recently, and that I've written about it as well. I'd be happy to share them. Maybe Hela can make them available for everyone. You're welcome. Do you agree? Yes? Any comments? Thank you.
You mentioned that, and I was very interested, Magda. Do you think that you as an architect can do something?
We have to, of course. I mean, you're talking about 70% of our population in Cairo lives fil ashwayat. To say that it's a hopeless case I would quit my job tomorrow if I thought that. I think there has to be something. And I think the first thing is to stop looking at it as a problem. And stop thinking of it as, it's interesting that for many years, the map of Cairo was drawn as central downtown Cairo that we are in and that we all know, and then this black belt, and then all these beautiful new Medinat Misharif Min, Medinat Misharif E, Hayy Misharif E, and then this black blob in between, and that was Al-Ashwayat. And that black blob began as a thin margin that the policymakers wanted to ignore, so they black it out. It doesn't exist. It's something, it's a problem, we'll deal with it later. But it has grown and has become the reality of our city. And not only our city, many cities all over the world. Again, I think that there is a lot that can be done. Like I think, first of all, documentation. We need to understand how these communities work, because they are working. I mean, the people that are living them are living functional lives. They are actually the majority of the service sector of our city. They are workers and employees and bank employees and teachers and everyone. I mean, I can not think of a single citizen that is not representative somewhere fil ashwayat, because they represent the majority of our city. They are the major stakeholders, 70%. So I think the first thing we need to do is documentation. The second thing we need to do is change our position from looking at it as a problem. We need to start defining it properly. I think this idea of self-organized communities, المجهودات الذاتية يا باشا دي, is a very good way of shifting the mindset. towards that. And thinking of small, what we call in architecture, architectural acupuncture. You find very effective things that you can do at a very low cost, things like the St. Augustine Barrio project of connecting them to the public transportation network in a way that doesn't force them to resort to the behaviors that they do. I mean, the traffic tuk-tuk microbus psychology is a means of survival. They have to get around the city. There was a very interesting project in Mumbai, in one of the largest actually, ashwaiya there, and they also have the tuk-tuk is actually an Indian invention. Yes. The Tata is an Indian invention. It's one of the biggest. They now own, I think, Rolls-Royce or something. They're like the largest automobile company in the world. They documented the tuk-tuk routes in this ashwaiya like a subway map. There are stations and there are stops and there are routes. It's not chaotic. It is very organized. It's like a shuttle system. They go from point A to point B, back and forth during certain times of the day. There are certain areas, yes, they may be managed in a mafia kind of way, but when you have no transit authority, of course there has to be a homegrown self-organized way of making this an economic viable system. So I think the first step is understanding them. The first step is shifting our awareness towards them. The first step is helping them mobilize their needs. And starting to reconnect our city to the informal city. And the most interesting things, I think, are happening between the formal and the informal. That area, that margin in between where we can create connections. And there are lots of projects that we're working on currently. In my studio now, I'm going back to them hopefully tomorrow to see their work. We're looking at the informal vending, البياعين الجايلين في محطة رمسيس, and how, again, in a similar way, we can change the mentality of let's not look at them as criminals, let's look at them as providers to our informal economy. Again, the informal economy in Egypt is 30% of our economy. That's a huge asset. If you make them disappear, you've lost 30% of your economy. So we're working on semi-legitimizing them, giving them sites and services, but in exchange, being able to organize them in a way and kind of do a payoff of here's your space, we'll give you this in exchange for you staying in this space and not encroaching on the public space that belongs to the citizens of the city. So these kind of negotiations of presenting a middle ground solution. Questions? Please.
بخصوص الموضوع بتاع using free material for architecture. بصراحة أنا في مثال بيحضرني في الموضوع ده. المساجد في العصور الوسطى الإسلامية كان فيها مشكلة كبيرة جدا، ويعني في عدد كبير جدا من الناس بيروح يصلي والإمام واحد ومفيش sound system عندهم. They make it like very wide and make the roof very high that the imam can stand on the member and say his speech, and they use the space for making sound moves, reflecting and reflecting and reflecting, so he can send his speech for a very big number of persons, and that's it.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent example. I'm going to steal your idea and use it, if you don't mind, when I talk about these free architectural elements. A lot of times I think that technology has actually made us lazy, because without a sound system, that's a brilliant example. I mean, without a sound system, how can you have these large conversations and how do they work? Then the architect is forced to really think about the acoustics of a space, and that's a beautiful example of a free acoustics. And acoustics, again, is one of the things tying back to the autism that plays a huge role, as you know, with children with autism, to manage the acoustics of a space, to make sure that they're only hearing what they need to be hearing and there's no kind of background and interference and so on. Yeah. Anyone else? Yes.
Firstly, I want to send you my thanks.
Thank you.
And I want to ask you if I'm looking for creativity.
Mm-hmm.
To be an architect, creative is restricted to talent or not? second question, or is the Egyptian architect lose the artistic spirit or not? Thank you.
Okay, you read my mind. These are the two questions I always start my classes with when I begin with my students at the beginning of semester. Because I have the lucky place of teaching very young architects when they first begin our program, and then I get to teach them again just before they graduate. So that's a wonderful experience to see them grow. And I always have students who come in the first day of class and say, I'm not very talented. I don't know how to draw. Ahmed and I taught a course for years together where they would come in and say, I don't know what I'm doing. And I can tell you that once they finished the course, those are the students that did the best work. And the reason is, when you are held back or when you are limited by the assumption of you know how to do something, then you have automatically only thought of a certain way to do it. But when you approach something with the attitude, I don't know how to do it, you're very open to all sorts of different ways of doing it. And that's what creativity is. I mean, when students ask me exactly the same question all the time, they're like, how can I be more creative? How can I do better work? What can I do? And I always tell them a quote by Henri Matisse, the famous brutalistic French painter, that creativity takes courage. You have to forget about this perfect image of being a certain person or doing a certain thing that looks a certain way, and experiment with as many things as you possibly can. That is my best advice to you, to being more creative. Be experimental, try out so many things, never say this isn't going to work. I mean, in the end, it's a drawing on a piece of paper. Nobody's gonna send you to jail, it's not gonna kill anyone. Why not try it out? Just experiment as much as possible. And with those of you who are students in programs that maybe don't have resources where you can work with models, I really encourage you to do it on your own. Model making and doing things with your hands is the best way, and our psychologist maybe can explain it psychologically, how the process of cognition is built most strongly when you actually do things. You could read about something from here until the end of days, and you still wouldn't be able to do it unless you did it yourself. And as much as architects are in love with and enamored, especially young students, digital technology, I have a lot of reservations about diving into it too early. I was working with a neuroscientist once, and he was talking about special needs, but he was talking about special needs software that helps children learn these cognitive skills of putting things together. And one mother said, well, why can't he do it on an iPad? And his answer made a lot of architectural sense to me. He said, the day you can teach your son how to swim on PlayStation is the day that you can learn space on an iPad. You have to do it with your hands. So any of you who want to kickstart your creativity, start building with your hands. Paper, cardboard, take recycled old drawings from last year's classes, cut them up and create those drawings. All these wonderful architects that you see begin with very preliminary models. What was your second question? You have to remind me. Of good architectural Egyptian architects? Yes?
Is the Egyptian architect lose the artistic spirit or not?
I mean, if you mean by, is there hope for Egyptian architecture to be beautiful again? Is that kind of your question? Then yes, I think there's hope that it can be beautiful again. I think we have lost a lot of the artistic spirit that we had historically. This building is a wonderful example. We've lost the quality of that in many ways. I blame the economy for it because people are building for money, and money is driving a lot of our decisions rather than culture and beauty. But I do an exercise with my students called Made in Egypt, Made by Egypt, Made for Egypt. And in it, we try and answer this question of what is good contemporary architectural vocabulary for Egypt that can be beautiful, that can be functional, that can be technical, that can be sustainable, that can be all these things that we talked about today, but still be Egyptian at the same time. And I'm hoping that as they grow up and as they graduate and move into the profession, that they will start building more. There are beautiful examples of architecture in Egypt. I mean, Abdel Halim Ibrahim, Rasim Badran, Abdul Wahid al-Wakil. There are a few, not many, architects doing very beautiful, very important work. I hope that more of them will come along, but I think that we've lost a little bit of it, but there's still hope to regain it again. Inshallah.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. بجد يعني it's amazing, inspiring, informative, everything. More than my imagination. So thank you very much. I would love to invite you to like our Facebook because Dr. Magda kindly accepted that we post the lecture on Facebook. If you want to, yeah. Okay. معلش, last question.
What is the public responsibility if I'm not an architect?
The last slide says it. I mean, I think the public needs to know what their rights are. We have a right to our city. We have a right to well-designed space. We have a right to well-designed buildings. We have to demand it. The voice of the people, the voice of the users, we have to be part of that dialogue as non-architects. And I mean, we forget sometimes that architects are citizens too. We are users of the buildings that everyone else lives in as well. Maybe we're more informed to be able to have that conversation, but I think it's really important. The best cities in the world are constantly, I constantly find that they're cities where their public is very well educated and well informed about the built environment. So we have to demand it, again, as a basic human right. مش عايزين اتفقنا مش هنخش في البوليتكس.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you. Our coming lecture is on February 23rd. It's about chocolate. I invite you all to come. أيوة, please come to eat chocolate في الفالنتين. Thank you. أيوة.